Hello everyone, today we talk about the Chueh, that is Göktürk warfare from the Chinese side of history. This is part of a series about sort of the armies of China and its neighbors, so for not saying enemies, given that they were also widely used as allies. I talked about the Gokturks already in the series about Eurasian steppes warfare, but I still haven't covered the topic in depth under other points of view, so let's simply add these pieces that may seem peripheral in some way, but are actually pretty sound, and also help looking at the same topic from different perspectives, historiographically, ethnically, internationally, as well, like in this case. I will keep calling the Gokturks here as Chueh, that is the Chinese term for these people. More or less what are the times and places. Early medieval, basically almost all of the longitude of Asia. An empire of the steppes at some point split into major halves, the eastern and the western. We will talk about this in a while. We also never talked about the Hsiung-nu, that, as you know, are quite interesting also in the perspective of how much they were related with the Hans, etc. Unfortunately, for these times and places, we know relatively few. Right, contemporary scholars have varying perspectives on the historical narrative of the same Chueh through, in fact, the Chinese tradition itself. Then at some point we will make more clarificatory videos about these peoples per se. This one is about their warfare, so we don't have to spend ourselves in describing the ethnogenesis of the people, but really steppes people's content is rocks really hard on Schwerpunkt, and that may pop up among the specials, unsurprisingly at this point. So traditional Chinese records indicate that the two Chueh, often referred to simply as Turks themselves, originated from a Hsiung-nu tribe that was compelled to migrate westward following a defeat by another Hsiung-nu group. Right, so a result of a Hsiung-nu civil war. The Hsiung-nu had been looming over China and north, say at the frontier, with the great. Say everything under heaven, this is the proper name of China, in the northeast of Asia, thus, and at some point they began to move, importantly enough, but not quite just as a single people. And this westward moving tribe within the same Hsiung-nu group eventually relocated to the Altai mountain range, settling in proximity to a prominent hill shaped like a helmet. This is a bit lost to legend, but it's important to look at also the moment, sort of the meanings. The area was abundant in iron ore deposits, enabling the two Chueh to develop exceptional skills in iron work. At least, it's not enough to just reach an iron ore rich area to be able to develop this craft. However, this people was evidently solid enough, having recovered from the initial displacement, come at the hands of sort of more, at least the threat of more powerful neighbors, and perhaps under this pressure they had sort of rolling up their sleeves and starting to organize themselves in a more efficient fashion, given their sort of nomadic predatory lifestyle and seeking new opportunities of conquest when possible. The two Chueh proficiency in ironwork, alongside the region's distinctive helmet-shaped hill, influenced their same name, as Chueh or Turk translates actually as a strong, right? There is a wide etymology at some point we will look at, but sometimes also across various languages it means helmet itself, and or at least this alter ego of the warrior that you can't count as a helmet, just like in the West. I don't know, the Germans likely were the spear men in etymology, etc. Now, this etymological connection, by the way, is supported by archaeological evidence where iron forges and weapons found in the Altai region indicate the same sophisticated metallurgical culture that could have helped providing with that further meaning, also connected with the capacity to mold metals, to handle like this power of the earth through heavenly blessing. The two Chueh's mastery of ironwork, as evidenced by unearthed swords and armor, allowed them to craft superior weapons such as composite bows with iron-tipped arrows, which increased their lethality in battle. Consider that even an iron tip in this space, very often when you see something extremely more primitive and poor materially wise, is actually a big deal. In any case, the steppes had already been producing quite impressive standards. So here we see the two Chueh essentially developing further along the pattern of the more advanced steppe conquerors. These technological advantages naturally were, not really the most important factor, nor there is any full evidence that the two Chueh had any of this compared to this or that other people around. But sure is that their craft fostered extensive trade networks, as well as they exchanged iron goods for horses and textiles, strengthening their economic and military dominance in Central Asia. Besides that crucial location is, of course, the crossroad of so many different civilizations, cultures, and the Silk Road is taking shape further. This fuels, in fact, if you look at the expansion of the Gokturks, as we were saying before, like they occupy pretty much the entirety of the steppe, of the Asian steppe, at least at the peak of their power, which is interesting because, as we discussed also in our recent question and answer video, the Gokturks were such a big empire at some point that were even able to express through their sources a sort of counter-civilizational, at least complaint towards countries like China, sort of warning the Turks not to be lured into that imperial reality as auxiliaries or whatever, because it would have corrupted their customs. Right? In many ways, it was also occurring actually at the moment of greatest low, so to say, of the great sanitary civilizations in the early Middle Ages. So we could debate about that. In any case, the two Chueh's control over all these resources positioned them as a pivotal force in shaping the nomadic confederacies of the steppes, influencing interactions with sedentary empires like China, but also Persia. In 545, Tumen Khan split the two Chueh into two branches. Notoriously, the eastern, who inhabited a territory reaching into the Gobi Desert, and the western, who expanded into Central Asia, eventually giving rise to different other groups, including the Uyghurs, thus the Seljuks and the Ottomans, ideally, right? Even though things were a bit more complicated. I made a video about the Uyghurs, Turks. If you're interested, of course, we made a lot about the later Seljuks and Ottomans, but it will be necessary to look a bit more at the broader ethnogenesis of these groups in the steppes, because they came at different waves of dominance that eventually broke and split into different groups that in turn at some point expanded somewhere else, if they were lucky. A smaller subgroup, the Tuyuhun, established themselves in northeastern Tibet, so actually close to China, which, as we've seen also in the videos about the same Tibetan warfare, stiffened the Tibetan resistance to Chinese imperial advances and participated also into those sort of well-coordinated raids that, in fact, the Turco-Tibetan forces were able to mount up with great logistical and strategic prowess, at some point looting China as well. And so also that corner it was very strategic and allowed to control further key trade routes that the Chinese chronicles, in fact, complain about. These chronicles, such as the Book of Zhu and other dynastic histories compiled by Chinese court historians, detail the two Yuhun's activities and their role in regional politics, providing, if anything, the primary source for understanding their action. By dominating passes like the Qinghai corridor, the two Yuhun in particular facilitated further contacts and dependencies, cultural exchanges, including the spread of Buddhist artifacts, for example, while also serving as a buffer against the same Tibetan incursions, because this was also a Turkic enclave into the broader Tibetan world, thus, affecting also the strategic balance of the region. Given such central location, of course, these peoples are recorded having taken part in different battles at different times, also when you can't quite necessarily have the certainty of whether this or that group were actually the ancestors, the descendants of a given people. But still, for example, there is the Battle of Sogdiana around 38 BC. I'm also preparing a video about the Battle of Pharsalus, just for saying what kind of era we are in. And the Chih-chih's tribe, on this occasion, drove out the Wuzun, initiating his ultimate doomed pursuit of power. At that time, the Wuzun resisted northeast of Sogdiana with the Altai mountain range located just south and slightly west of this area. The Wuzun were characterized by their fair hair and blue or green eyes. They were essentially Indo-Europeans, set apart from the Hsiung-nu that were more Turkic. And this distinct phenotype suggests, in fact, that they were the descendants of different Aryans that had settled there in the millennium before. Their physical traits definitely aligned with descriptions of steppe peoples, also in ancient texts like the Chih-chih, potentially also looking at a mingling with the Scythians or Sarmatians for how we can understand where they ended, especially in the east. So why are we talking about this? Because let's say the Chih-chih were a foundational, they're basically, it's a collection of historical texts authored by the historian Sima Qian in the 1st century BC. And chronicling the nomadic people's deeds, their interaction with the Han dynasty at the time, offering detailed accounts of, as we've seen, the Wuzun, for example, informing us of our distinctive identity. Also their martial tradition, long archery tactics, that are, of course, part of that broader area. And we know, through the source, that the Topa Turks, that were at the time the tribe of what we think the eastern two Chueh would practically be, were governed by a lineage of kings with yellow beards. Right? So we talked about this to stress the fact that these Turks may have actually been Aryan, right? That these weren't, as it happens all across Eurasia, the same Chinese Empire could have been founded by Indo-Europeans, as far as we know, given the spread of Indo-European tactics during the Bronze Age, and the fact that, again, we get this kind of references to specific fair colors and so on. It may have been well plausible that across the steppes, especially we are in the 1st century BC, so a time in which the Turks, the Mongols, were mostly relegated in the northeast of Asia, and the Indo-Europeans still held sway in the steppe, that some of these peoples that eventually we regard as Turks, because later on they sprang out of the steppes in a dominant fashion, and so some groups had already done so, but had remained, in fact, previously under a broader Indo-European hegemony. It wasn't, of course, marked by specific territorial boundaries, and even less from a social-cultural point of view, so that the actual higher race of rulers came very often from the Indo-European royalty, and came to in fact to rule over this other peoples who were, according to the traditional doctrine of the case, is rigidly separated to an extent at least, especially like the bottom from the elite, right? And so when you look at this early age, there is obviously a great deal of debate whether we can consider the ancestors, and more the founders of what would become the Gokturks empire, right? Especially considering that the extension of the latter. But this is exactly the bottom line with most steppes, sort of dominions, that rather than considering these groups as some sort of, again, rigidly separated communities, especially the steppes should be understood as something periodically like electing new leaders from some floating dynasties over this ocean of tribesmen across the steppes, and that at some point, right, reconnect with one another also in terms of blood and more. So this aspect is quite important, and the connection even between some of the greatest later Turkic empires and the Indo-Europeans is also quite obvious, considering the fact that the Indo-Europeans basically dominated, as we've seen in our videos about the Sakas, and more quite far northeastern Asia. Like the Turks and the Mongols were really relegated in some very sort of fringe ghetto kind of position, right? And when they sprang out of there, taking over the steppes in a moment of sort of general exhaustion of not just the great civilizations. So it's well possible that the aforementioned Topa Turks, that would become the leading tribe of the eastern two Chueh, had a lot to do with Wuzund, right? And that this is somehow mixed a bit like ours, at least ethnically speaking. Now, this is particularly important in a civilizational sense because, as we explained in other videos where people were asking at the point, why did, for example, China recompact when the Roman Empire didn't, etc. There is often a misconception of the levels of civilizational continuum. I mean, Rome was never taken over by nomadic peoples, all right? You had Germans that had been to a degree semi-nomadic due to the fact that they moved at some point, sometimes very slowly across Europe, but that had been fundamentally very Romanized. They were kin to the Romans in a racial sense across Europe. But when you look at China, you realize that this was actually taken over by the Turks at some point. And the Turks, say we're talking late antiquity here, that took over China, were the same Topa Turks. In fact, roughly 3 to 4 centuries after the aforementioned Chih-chih's death that had affected the Wuzund, the Topa Turks overthrew the Chinese dynasties of the north, establishing, in fact, the non-Chinese Wei dynasty there. This is, again, quite momentous because it's as if you had some Turks led by some Indo-European dynasty that came to rule over China in a big sort of, it's not like much of a question mark, but this is sort of sometimes even the basic information that we have and that we can think of. There may be some, general considerations to be made about what does it mean, this sense, to be Turkic at this point. You can think that the golden beard as a symbol of, divine potential could have been metaphorical, but in many ways we do know that. In fact, the Indo-Europeans were still there, even when the Turks came to be more dominant around. And so again, we must also understand what Turk would have meant, right? Today we mostly think of it as a genetic or a racial connotation. But ethnoculturally, things can get pretty mixed along that pattern instead. So to paradoxically continue, what is sort of more interesting than Indo-European legacy at some point, even in Turkic history, And as you understand, as we said before, in also Uyghurs, Seljuk, Ottoman, and this would be sort of a checkmate. The ultimate one would be, again, China, founded by Indo-Europeans, but it's absolutely plausible, right? Historiography is 100% positive about the fact it could have well happened without any problem. And that's also the reason why we should talk much more about identity in ancient times, because it's a deeply traditionally universal understanding of the same issue than we often think. This transition, by the way, in China with the Topa takeover brought also to a significant shift in the balance of power. In fact, you see the Turks at this point using their disciplined cavalry and strategic alliances, exploiting, therefore, both the steppes interconnections, but especially the political divides within China to take over the northern part of that, and starting to more directly integrate nomadic tactics with Chinese administrative systems. Why is this important? Because the Chinese empires were also talking about before the comparison with Rome, in this sense, was really taken over by these peoples. And it wasn't simply like, that there's the issue of the federati, but there are some similar dynamics telling the truth. But the takeover is more complete. There is some sort of greater, say, in part, say not greater necessarily compared to the West, but say some replaceability of the rulers on the basis of a sound sort of imperial foundation. But these rulers are really the barbarians of the steppes, right? The nomads, right? Not really the half-civilized Germans in this case that are of the same race of basically Europeans as a whole, regardless of divides between, again, the Baltic areas, the Mediterranean, etc. In any case, the Topa's takeover of northern China created a hybrid state at this point. It was not the Chinese anymore just imitating the nomadic populations by, for example, importing their heavenly horses from Fergana Valley that we also made a military historical unit video for, at least from the Persian side of the story and the Hellenistic, the Roman one. But that truly took over, right? Naturally, this hybrid, yes, continued with some sort of cultural, social Chinese dominance, but these were truly also conquering nomads that had just installed themselves over the local populace. And this is something similar to what would happen in other instances in Chinese history. Besides, this same hybrid state would influence other Chinese dynasties proper, like such as the Sui, the Tang. Made a video about Tang warfare. If you're interested, you can look at what that had become in a few centuries. Especially, in fact, as far as the adoption of cavalry-based warfare, to an extent, the Chinese had maintained an important degree of infantry centrality. These Turks, at least at large, brought the cavalrymen on the fore in unprecedented ways. You know that during the migration year, essentially there is a long-term shift towards cavalry gaining the upper hand on infantry, unlike what it had been the case during classical antiquity in the senator world. So this originary Chih-chih's campaign against the Wusun may have indirectly positioned the latter as ancestors of the two Chueh, a theory supported by the integration of Wusun remnants into Turkic tribes, as suggested by their shared use also of sort of composite bows and horse breeding techniques, which became hallmarks of two Chueh military strength, but more in general because of the references to the golden beard, the fact that this population, yes, would have integrated in a Turkic-dominated world was increasing its sort of characteristics also from a military point of view in a certain direction compared to the Indo-Europeans that had tendentially been more knightly. In essence, they had also tended to settle down a bit within the same steppe, not just as full nomads. And so it's definitely possible that, given especially also the Wusun geographical location, the connection with the later Göktürks through Chueh is absolutely plausible as well. Let's look a bit at more in depth at the military organization of these people. So, the earliest documented organization of the Topa to Chueh is recorded around 440 AD. Right. So remember, we're talking that chunk of Turks that eventually had sprung at least of the system that would come to dominate the steppe in the following period. Even more specifically, the Tabgatk horde. Neighboring tribes likely adopted, of course, comparable system within the Topa framework, but it's relevant, of course, to look at this specific indication as well. Of course, Turks fought in pretty similar ways, as we've seen also in the video about, again, in the series about Eurasian steppes of warfare, but there are changes within the steppes during centuries, and different waves, again, have slightly different characteristics in sequence. But again, in the moment, we can't imagine radical changes. No. The supreme leader, known as the Khan, or possibly Shan-yu, which is also, again, this blend of Turkic and Chinese terminology, in this case even more relevant, exactly because these people took over China, held overall command. Right, military units were organized in a precise decimal hierarchy, which is really typical of the steppes. A commander of 10,000 was termed a Yabgu, a 1,000 a Shad, a 100 a Tekin, and of 10 a Tudu. This decimal system reflected in the Orkhon inscriptions allowed for rapid mobilization and coordination of large forces across vast distances, a critical advantage in the fluid warfare of the steppes. The decimal system is the most straightforward, especially for troops that at large are horse archers, do not have much of a broader training in order to maintain a compact formation, whatever. So you have like a leader, and around this guy that there is an orbit of different satellites, right, that run back and forth, like paving the way of their leader into battle. This is true for the various units increasing in scale up the hierarchy. The Orkhon inscriptions naturally are not a random source. This is a series of 8th century stone monuments erected by the same Gokturks in the Orkhon Valley of Mongolia, containing Turkic runic texts that narrate their military achievements and organizational system, providing a primary source for understanding their governance and warfare. These inscriptions are, again, the basis for most of Turkic sort of warfare understanding, let's say, of in the era. The system's efficiency is evident, by the way, in the Chueh's ability to launch simultaneous raids across multiple fronts, overwhelming smaller adversaries, at time sort of really exploiting to the extent of taking over the entire steppe, really the exhaustion of the same, the political frailty of certain groups, and so homogenizing a bit the hegemony, so to say, the dominion over this territories. The Western Chueh leader's bodyguard was called Fuli or Wolf. It consisted of 200 men. This also shows, by the way, that there is not just a decimal system. At different times, like armies would have followed ad hoc sizes, composition, expressing tactical needs that we don't precisely understand, but that are completely, say, understandable in a general sense, or rather. Sometimes the sources also provide us with symbolic numbers. In this case, perhaps connected with the wolf in Turkic mythology, that we can discuss at some point. You know that this was attentively intended as the banner of the Göktürk Khaganates. We will also talk about that later as far as the two Chueh units and appearance is concerned. Of course, such a nomadic animal loaded with especially the sense of war-bending activity, the wolf pack, the lowest sort of followers aspect. This is very much present across the entire world, and again from China to Europe in pretty straightforwardly similar ways. Besides, legends recorded in Chinese annals tell us that the two Chueh claimed descent from a she-wolf, right? This would have been, again, a broader anthropological concept that indeed so many other cultures shared. The Romans, first and foremost, the she-wolf in particular, adds to that sort of chthonic element that, however, is conducive to, in fact, a springing out, right? We've explained this in the video about Livy's account on the origins of Rome, right? And we will surely get a bit more into that specific. And the aforementioned Chinese annals, including the aforementioned Book of Zhu and Sui, are official histories compiled by imperial scholars, and that for this reason document the two Chueh's origins and interactions with China, offering insight in their ethnogenesis, in their culture, military culture. So there is a need to explain, like from a universal Chinese perspective, where did these enemies come from and what kind of path had led them to rule in great parts of China herself. The aforementioned symbolism reinforced the Saint Khan's divine authority, fostering loyalty among elite warriors and the newly initiated sort of wolves, enhancing unit cohesions during campaigns, which was a bit like as always, the gold standard, like moral force, right? Political cohesion, breaking the more sparse. Doesn't matter how many there were, but if they didn't hang together, they were not able to hold a quite motivated and compact force. The elite of the Chueh that would have been expressed by the nobility, but also, in fact, the leaders of the aforementioned war bands roaming outside also some sort of more pacified space, depending on which part of to Chueh's history and settlement we're looking at, were primarily composed of heavily armored cavalry, right? Then you would have unarmored light cavalry in large numbers following them. At some point we find camelry before we observe Sogdian, and you know that those are frontier areas that at some point also the Arabs will venture into, using the local breeds of camelids that are particularly resistant to the brusque thermic excursions of the steppes, and facilitated a big deal logistics. This is also true for the Chinese when they literally crossed the Himalaya at some point. So again, looking at Tibet's mountains, the Tarim basins, vast expanses, you realize how versatile armies had to be effective. It is really a prerogative, in fact, of steppe peoples that had very particular, also, as you know, horse breeds. I made a video about the Mongol one that in many ways was already there at this point, because also what's really the difference between Turks and Mongols to some degree, right? Were designed to, for example, oxygenate more, to be able to resist at higher altitudes, crossing impervious passes, but also being quite sort of bulky and sort of sturdy, resisting all kind of other strains, and also, in fact, being able to go on for longer than, in some ways, more performing in interest of agility, or also of size, depending on like European horses, but in fact quite aptly designed for the Turco-Mongol environment in Central Asia. Naturally, most Göktürks fighters were constituted, especially if you think about in the early Middle Ages, really Central Asia, by undisciplined, inadequately trained, and somewhat ineffective troops. That's when the leader's role has the greatest importance in many ways, the capacity to galvanize through his own charisma the conquering fantasies of these peoples, and so convincing them to follow him and to stick together to that extent that these literal oceans of horse archers could overwhelm, or at least adequately soften up the enemy before the ultra-heavy elite charged into the center of enemy force. We can't even begin to understand the brutality of a time like this, right? We have different examples. In 622 AD clash with the Tang Chinese, Qadir Khan, commanding an army of 150,000 divided into 10,000 men units, suffered 5,000 losses, merely 3.3% of the total force, according to at least the quite improbable source number. Yet the entire army fled in disarray, which is sort of given the 5,000 losses in absolute terms, which in this time of shortage of manpower as well, like, would have been really a lot. This was a Karduk force, by the way, that would have been basically the same part of the Göktürk kind. And overall, of course, again, explaining the Göktürk Khaganate just through sort of a military lens, without telling the evidential history of the war, is a bit difficult. But it's obvious, as we were saying before, that the Göktürks were able sort of to take over these immense spaces, not much because they had an unprecedented power in absolute or qualitative terms. In many ways, yeah, of course, they were tremendously powerful just out of the sheer size of this dominion, right? But in many ways, it's this worked to a degree. The Khaganate also split, yes, but because the steppes had been exhausted, as we explained before, so a moment of sort of necessary pause and rebooting was definitely relevant. This was done with great difficulty by all cultures and civilizations involved, right? And this fragility, including the lack of specific military cohesion at this point, was due to the disloyalty among tribes within the same branch and between the eastern and western branches that, of course, came to antagonize with one another as well, because they were pulled from different directions by different powers that naturally tried to maintain control in some part of the Silk Road as it was consolidating, and these guys were just in between, and much of the rule was relatively stable for the time, but still entailing strife, dynastic competition, and an important degree of sort of typical nomadic instability. The Tang Chinese skillfully employed diplomacy, enlisting the eastern Tu-shue as eager mercenaries in their own campaigns against the western Tu-shue. So essentially extending as far as the east part of the Göktürk Khaganate was concerned. This is a bit, something that the Western and Eastern Roman Empire did, of course, in a completely different context and by scale with the Federati. And the stronger side in the East, in fact, was able in part to maintain at least greater control on some of these allies, let's call them this way. Naturally, there was also a lot of warfare going on between the Chinese and the same Eastern two Chueh, just the West. And of course, the participation of Eastern two Chueh against the West, especially from 630 to 682, was just also an extension of the rivalry between the same Gokturks. This Chinese policy, documented in the Tang Shu, exploited tribal rivalries, offering tributes of silk and grain to secure Eastern two Chueh loyalty, which fragmented the two Chueh confederacy in turn and allowed the Tang to dominate Central Asian trade routes in a quite consistent fashion. Again, I made a video about Tang's military. If you're interested in that, you can check that out. The aforementioned Tang Shu, or Book of Tang, is comprehensive Chinese dynastic history compiled in the 10th century, detailing Tang military campaigns and diplomatic relations with nomadic groups like the Tuchue, and so providing a primary record of these interactions and a sort of overall view on the international situation, the major wars, and the policy towards these Turkic auxiliaries. Furthermore, in 649, the Uyghur Turks, we also discussed them in another chapter of the Eurasian Steppes Warfare series, under the leader Jin, that at least we have to understood as a name filtered to Chinese sources, and based just west of the Altai range, supplied allegedly 50,000 troops to support the Chinese military efforts, a contribution that definitely strengthened Tang control over the Silk Road further and facilitated their, in fact, attempt to expand westward. When we look at these big numbers, I was discussing that just the other day. Remember that cultural factors, very often Eastern sources tend to round up numbers in order to exaggerate them, to say, okay, well, this is the big level international kind of deal. China is immense, and so also the support from some of these barbarians. Well, when you look at 50,000, it's impossible to presume that there was simply like an army of 50,000 Turks, more or less obeying to the Chinese in a unitary sense. But it's possible that these numbers reflect some broader movements also of the non-fighters of these nomadic communities that in part moved, aside from, again, the war bands, also with all their families, all their possessions. And the fact that these peoples figured as allies, supporting the Chinese by simply settling somewhere that the empire had granted them, thus working as a sort of buffer state against other Turks, and this is also really normal in the picture. The Uyghurs' involvement, as recorded in Tang military dispatches, by the way, included supplying horses and archers, which bolstered the Tang's mobile warfare capabilities, ensuring important successes like in the Tarim Basin. We looked at that as far as Kucha warfare is concerned. There is a lot of Tocharian history, given that we discussed the Wuzun as well. There is all an interconnection there. The Tarim Basin was the opening to Western Eurasia for China, and the local conquests were carried out through also substantial Turkic support. In many ways, also considering the strategical and logistical stretches, the Imperial Chinese army could not simply, at least, remain forever there as a field force of some sort. So, of course, Turkic auxiliaries were fluidifying the campaign by also gaining something. through, say, the Chinese support, namely also taking over these areas that, in these cases, for example, had witnessed the development of Indo-European city-states all along the sort of the perimeter, let's say, of the foothills of the mountains surrounding the outlining the time base. It's obvious that China had always been using nomadic auxiliaries, that this is really a leitmotif throughout all what we've seen in ancient medieval times and beyond, right? So definitely a regular auxiliary force, so to say, that next to the professional military helped mostly to raid, to plan to pave the way, to working as antenna scouting, reconnaissance, and more for the heavy troops. This is true, of course, also for the elite of the Turkic forces that that served along the same Chinese military. But if you look at the numbers, it seems like in this area there were more Turks than Chinese, of course, during these wars. By the way, the aforementioned dispatches from which we get also some of this information are official military reports preserved in the Tang archives. They document, for example, the logistics and contributions of allied tribes, offering detailed evidence of the role in Tang campaigns, and they are really an exceptional source, even in its generic information. By 841, the Kirghiz Turks, we talked about these two again in the Eurasian Steppes series, emerged as the dominant tribe within the same Göktürk confederacy. Again, the way you can sort of think that the Gokturk Khaganate was some sort of universal steppe empire, so basically all the Turks were within it, in a way or another. In any case, the Kirghizes, led by their ayat and bearing red standards, contended with the Khitan for dominance over the central steppes. We talked about the Khitan. By the way, we are in the later phase, like we are in the High Middle Ages already, so we're looking essentially also at the rise of the Mongols. In the meanwhile, there was another chapter opening at the exhaustion, in fact, of the great Turkic Khaganates of the early Middle Ages. The Kirghiz were notably tall, with reddish hair, pale skin, and greenish eyes, at least according to Chinese records, having a distinctive tradition of tattooing only their hands, which made them ethnically recognizable in different ways. And this, again, reddish hair, pale skin, greenish eyes are, if you remember, just from almost 1 millennium before, the hallmark of the Wu zone and of a likely Indo-European ancestry. So you see these populations maintaining an important degree of ethnic continuity with the populations inhabiting the steppes before the Turkic waves took over. And again, the way the Turkic say Khaganates had emerged, it's something sort of very complex. At some point we'll have to explain, mostly under a political, of course, religious and cultural point of view, rather than simply, again, people came out of a certain place. Many of these were the descendants of the previous inhabitants of the region. This unique Kirghiz cultural practice, noted in Chinese records, served a marker of identity and social status as well. Just yesterday we were talking about the traditional notion of a hierarchy of races, of nations in the Middle Ages. And this is very, very straightforward in the steppe, where you really have one tribe that normally rules over broken peoples that become their subjects. That also why there are all those horse archers, because they are the defeated, right, stripped of their wealth. Even though there wasn't too much wealth, of course, in the steppes to begin with, and that's also the reason. But in general, there was an hegemonic force that stemmed from an ancient clan, having sort of also strengthened up in military terms and in armament and implementing collective training, in fact, providing also heavier cavalry. So you could recognize a people from another, not just in a visual sense, but knowing what that appearance was connected with in terms of their current political international status, right? This reinforced tribal cohesion for everybody involved, and that's how the Kirghizes as well sort of stood out as an important people in this area. The aforementioned Chinese records encompass various dynastic histories as well as local gazetteers describing the Kirghizes' physical traits and customs, and being, again, yet another precious primary source for understanding their nature. The tattoos likely signified, by the way, a warrior rank. People often say these were autotropaic in nature. The tattoo it's also a way to show divine that basically there is no need of a protection, actually. Like armor, for example, which is a way that steppes peoples have, but not only think about the initiated, the youth, and also in the sedentary populations, the skirmishers, the velites, etc., that need to prove to God that God is their only shield, their only protection. So that there is a moral quality that has to be selected and refined through this sort of initiation rite. Of course, tattoos at some point extended to greater significance, but there was, of course, some, let's say, at least brand of military and social prestige connected with this or that group that thus sort of had a mark, like signifying that specific connection with God. This similarity, by the way, this shared symbolism enhanced morale and loyalty in combat. It was also a mean of recognition, as we've seen also among the ruling peoples. Most of the warriors were lightly armored, to say the least. During the Khitan Empire, the Liao that we documented between the 10th and the 11th century, the Gay tribe, is it spelled Ghei? That this is, of course, like all transliterated from other peoples, formed an alliance with these new Chinese rulers, so to say. We're talking the Liao, right? So they were actually Mongol, and they had been controlling northern China themselves. The Gay were unique in the region, but they were relying solely on unarmored cavalry and foot archers, a tactical choice that allowed them to adapt to the forested and mountainous terrains of the Liao Empire, that again in the north did not just encompass the steppes, and not just within China, by the way. This is something we observed as far as this parts of the Mongol fringe in their variation looked really like, contrasting in fact with the open steppe warfare of other Turco-Mongol groups. Telling the truth, steppe infantry was a thing since ever, not just because obviously every horseman can dismount, but because there would be in fact tactical situations, especially in defending certain camps, as we've seen, the Altai Mountain, not everything is a flat land. In the steppe, things can be more complicated. We've seen the same Mongols at different times in history, even when facing other horse archers, mounted armies dismounted, using their horses as barricades, literally. Poor animals, by the way, considering all the the arrows that flew at times in the millions. I'm not kidding. I discussed this in the video about Mongol logistics. That's definitely but that also tells you how scarce armor actually was overall in the picture. So again, you can have very good craftsmanship, as we've seen for the Göktürk in general, looking at their metallurgy, etc. But at the same time, not necessarily like this affluence whereby everybody would be able to have enough protection. But indeed, like in more forested terrains and more, say, on woodlands or some sort of more complex terrain, you would need to use some sort of more fixed positions. Horse archers could dismount, inform, and carry out like important, support for cavalry who's still out there operating, creating barrages of arrows, volleys that really were that damaging, especially against, again, cavalry finding themselves on a slowed down by an accidented terrain. This is something that allowed, by the way, this apparently and sometimes more primitive peoples at some point to overrun even more advanced empires nearby. This is the case in northeast China when you look at those Mongol powers alternating before the Kirghizes came around. I just made a video about the Yurken that were exactly the guys who kicked the Liao's backside, coming from that background. And so there are different peoples, different traditions. Again, tracking them in a more precise fashion is a challenge, but these are just introductory videos. We have plenty of options for later as well. The gay reliance on archery, as evidenced by arrowheads found in Liao-era sites, enabled precise long-range attacks, making them effective in ambushes against heavier Khitan cavalry as well, if they could bog them down. Speaking of tactics of the Göktürks and all these affiliated groups, so to say, the standard Chueh cavalryman was, in the heavier case, equipped with armor, forming the core of their heavy cavalry, that in turn was again surrounded by much greater groups of horse archers, of lighter cavalrymen. Camels, we mentioned before, were really plentiful. They were kept normally in reserve to disrupt enemy cavalry on some occasions because horses become nervous around camels. You can't quite always use them in this way, but it was done also by other peoples around. A prevailing superstition about the lunar cycle shaping the Gokturks' tactics, with raids conducted exclusively during the waxing moon, was a practice rooted in Turkic cosmological beliefs, as recorded in the same Orkhon inscriptions describing celestial omens guiding military campaigns. Nothing was done without astrological support, because there was a very specific power instantiation as the celestial vault was mirroring divine will in the process. There was naturally a psychological component to that, with, for example, lunar phases associated with divine favor. This could bring either side to hesitate or be more eager to engage during such periods. The reliance on armored cavalry gave the Chueh tactical advantage in direct engagements, as they were the dominant force, so they had the strongest heavies out there for a while. But their dependence on mobility also often left them vulnerable to disciplined infantry formations at times. This is seen in their defeats, for example, against tank infantry that was constituted by spearmen, but also by crossbowmen whose volleys disrupted cavalry charges, as the heavy infantry, in fact, was the most effective way to hold their physical impact, right? So the Turks would respond in the same way, like the threat of cavalry charge, but first the softening up of the enemy lines. Also through these swarms, imagine the chaos, the dust, the confusion. You wouldn't know this was a typical nomadic step when the heavies were going to come out of this swarm that would suddenly open and smash into the heavy cavalry. So it was mostly about also exchanging a lot of darts from both sides during the engagement. This is really typical. We've seen it actually in Europe as well, whenever the senators confronted the nomads. So, if we evaluate the Khan's forces, you can argue that heavy cavalry could be even the majority of the two Chueh. This does not account for the majority, however, of what we would think like the Turkic Khaganate force during this people's rule. It looked like, because these were the subjects and they had unarmored cavalry in great quantities. Besides, this was true in part even for the minority of the two Chueh. Armored cavalry was probably there as such. The unarmored type, however, being much more common. Again, camels were so precious, even from a tactical point of view at times, but mostly from a logistical point of view, facilitating the mobility of the steppes armies, sometimes very big steppes armies, across this unforgiving territory. The gay auxiliaries were something like they could provide, as we've seen, unarmored infantry, archers, unarmored cavalry, horse archers in great quantities, plus some, of course, noblemen would be heavier in its regard. And, of course, if you look at all the extent of the Gokturks history, and even it's prehistory, as we've seen, who did they descend from? We would never end the video, of course. Now, overall, the Gokturks could dominate the almost entirety of the steppes in virtue of their art of war, of their flexibility, the capacity to adapt to different combat environments, balancing heavy shock troops with lighter, more mobile units to maintain flexibility according to theater, operation, campaign, and battle. The high proportion of armored cavalry is noted in Tang military reports, and again, considering that this empire dominates the entirety of the Asian steppes, you could find a picked body of heavier troops, a bit like it starts happening with the having of the cavalryman as an elite guy, as a protector of the community in the West as well, especially after the mid-6th century. Here, rather than mobilizing larger amounts of troops that were available and would, from time to time, be, in fact, forced into campaign, there could be a decent number of very well-armored and armed cavalrymen that were a bit like the optimum between, again, the sustainability and the overstretch. The tanks that were quite active, as we've seen also in Central Asia, use these two Chueh's auxiliaries on a regular basis, knew better. So this aligns with their accounts of the two Chueh being capable of carrying out devastating charges. The usefulness of cavalry across desert terrains, especially extending the two Chueh's operational reach. Also, to some extent, enabling surprise attacks on trade caravans, and as we've seen, the cavalry was occasionally engaged in combat as well. So it's a very rich tapestry of strategical and tactical tales and imagery. An interesting clash where the Chinese made considerable use of Turkic auxiliaries in the period is the 644 one of Kucha that we described also in the video about Kuchan warfare, which is not Kushan warfare, even though etymologically they are related and also in part ethnically. But I made a video about those two, so you can check both to understand what we're talking about. So this is the Tang dynasty's reconquest of the Tarim Basin, leading to this major showdown fought to secure the city-state of Kucha. It was the most powerful of the many, the multiple ones as we've seen, skirting the Tarim Basin. The Kuchan army, consisting of armored cavalry, was led by King Holy Pu-shih-pi, known as Divine Flower. These were literal Aryans. If you look at certain sources of the era connected with the Kuchan, which also illustrate Turks next to them, that are different looking, at least, illustrate them still at this point as purely like blonde, but real light blonde, very white skinned, and they are one of the relics of that, in this case, kind of more gentrified Indo-European steppe cultures, turned in fact into a urban system. So during this battle, the Chinese forces, commanded by General A-shih-na Shö-eul, through again the Chinese term, this was a leader of Turkish descent, included Chinese regulars, 2 Chueh allies, and 2 lak that would have been the aforementioned Uyghur Turkic auxiliaries. Using a classic Hsiung-nu strategy, the Chinese feigned a retreat to provoke the Kuchan army into a reckless pursuit. We're not talking about a tactic, but a literal strategy. This was done by the Turks against the Chinese at different points. It was just a matter of, come and get me if you can, and at that point stretching the enemy lines. The Tibetans massacred lots of Chinese that way. So once exposed in open terrain, the Kuchan forces were encircled and defeated. We know this view in general, but you can imagine how this practically occurred. Naturally, it would have been a climatic battle, etc. Like, we don't have, like, again, in movies that, one army is completely annihilated just out of anything. This would have been closely, hardly fought affairs. Nevertheless, this tactic capitalized on the two Chueh's tendency for aggressive pursuit, turning their mobility against them and securing tank control over a critical Silk Road hub. And the victory, as recorded in the Tangsu, ensured tank dominance over Kucha's oasis trade routes that was really this cornerstone of international trade, weakening local resistance, facilitating Chinese cultural influence, including the spread of Confucian administration. But in more concrete terms, the actual Turkic takeover of the Tarim Basin, once ruled by these Indo-European independent city-states. Incredibly fascinating context indeed. Let's pass to some Turkic arms and armor from the period. Let's talk about the for example, 581 AD account of the Turkic to Chueh, depicting a cavalryman with loose hair, armed with a bow, lance, and either a scimitar, so to say, a saber, or long sword, which is not necessarily again that strictly differentiated. There was, as we just said, a lot of Indo-European influence, which, as you know, had normally come with straight swords, right? That would remain in some parts of, also the Middle East up to the 11th century, as we described those original styles as well. So outskirts of Eurasia that were in very much influenced by the Turks, but not quite to have had that tradition lost. The reason why sabers were coming more along is the aforementioned exhaustion of the steppes. The fact that it actually takes less training to use a saber than a straight knightly sword. Essentially, you could have massive sabers, veritable scimitars that could cut through armors, etc. But overall, all these hordes of now savages springing out from the bowels of the steppes, especially from the more depressed parts after the Indo-European dominance, were coming with this sort of greater hunger, less order, as we've seen tendentially. So less sophistication, but still, it was easy to arm all these people through the simpler sports. So this Göktürk primary, the Gokturks' primary defense was a metal cuirass. In the case of properly an elite nobleman, complemented by a buckler roughly 1 foot in diameter, especially with pretty heavy armor, it was useless to have bigger shields. And in any case, in the steppes, aside from some infantry, we don't really see big shields to begin with, because also the horse archer had the best protection in his speed rather than in the sort of leather skin bucklers that they had on their own. The aforementioned 841 AD account of the Kirghiz tribe indicates that their cavalrymen used wooden leg and foot armor and carried red standards. Of course, they would have carried standards of any color, as far as we know, but again, there would have been a prevalence that marked them as Kirghizes. A hierarchical dress code, of course, was typical of steppes cultures, and it was enforced to some extent. So that even though speaking of uniforms sounds anachronistic, but there had always been something of that kind tendentially. The minimum to be recognized, and again, together with some specific identity, traditional symbolism. The commander or ayet wore a heavy sable hat in winter and a pointed metal helmet in summer. Lower ranks wore white felt hats, while the lowest ranks were forbidden from wearing hats or any furs or skins, by the way, as a proof that, again, they were quite brutally kept under, again, these new conquerors of the steppes were not tender at all with their subjects, and they, of course, despised their foe, which is also part of the reason why these systems altogether were not even that overwhelmingly successful. They had lost that sort of more egalitarian vibe that still the sort of very feudally, seigneurially ordered Indo-European society had for millennia. The 200-man bodyguard that we remember before for a Western Chueh chieftain would have typically worn elaborately brocaded coats beneath their armor and braided their hair, which, as you know, is yet another very common mean of ethnic distinction. This sartorial hierarchy reinforced social stratification and military discipline, with visual distinction signaling immediately rank and allegiance. So you knew in the middle of the steppes more or less who you were coping with, which is sort of, for us, like regular, 21st century slop, like something that we wouldn't be able even to organize for ourselves. Now, the use of brocaded coats, likely acquired through Silk Road trade, underscored the bodyguards' elite status, enhancing their prestige in diplomatic encounters, for example, with neighboring states. But this is also what the steppes peoples normally do. They carry a lot of wealth with themselves, like they tend to show off wealth. The few one they often have, even as fairly affluent members of their societies, by simply covering themselves in it, so that on the battlefield outside, like, people would recognize them, would understand that, say, I don't know, this guy didn't have to be killed if you didn't want all his clan on your tail. So that is useful for everybody involved. There is a sort of proto-heraldic, you could even term knightly identification. To Chueh, an armored cavalryman would have been relatively similar to the heavier types. Imagine the heavier type mostly, it's not even just a huge difference between the armor. Now, of course, if you had metal armor at large, you were a heavy cavalry. You would fight with a lance for shock charges, and of course, you could use other weapons, side ones, but also the same bow at some point. The lighter types of Gokturks would be armed, however, with javelins. They wouldn't have a cuirass, of course, also a bow and quiver. Never underestimate, however, how effective javeliners can be, especially against armored opponents, right? And in fact, you have to be a bit more effective and to come close at range to another horseman, differently from a horse archer that may have a very performing, as we've seen, composite bow, cases, especially the most costly ones, as we've seen, reinforced also with metal parts to create this more elastic effect. The contrast is mostly between the harder front, like with horns, tassels, or something like that, and the inner sort of more like animals' intestines, more elastic kind of element to increase, in fact, the releasing power. But at a distance, right, at hundreds of meters sometimes, the javeliner is a guy that is more active. And actually, there is all a segmentation in Turkic armies at this point, as also throughout steppes warfare, not only that practices this sort of more shorter range combat, admittedly getting more often into hand-to-hand one, but still being effective as far as still missiles, javelin warfare. This type of lighter cavalry's clothing featured brighter colors than those of the Hsiung-nu counterparts, as we will at some point document them, reflecting increased trade with the Western world in particular, which brought vibrant textiles and cultural influences from Sogdian and Persian merchants. Intercontinental trade went on throughout all the early Middle Ages, enhancing the Chueh's material culture. These textiles, often adorned with intricate patterns, were not only decorative but also served as diplomatic gifts, strengthening alliances with Western powers and facilitating the Chueh's integration into broader Eurasian trade networks. Besides, some clothing can serve as armor, like even among the least sophisticated Göktürk horsemen. You would have had pretty, surprisingly effective padded sort of felt jackets. Besides, consider how heavy or how effective, in a sense, your vestments have to be in such tough environments like one of the steppes, with dramatic thermic excursions, not just throughout the year, but simply from day to night. Again, the Gokturks dominate such a vast expanse that we can't speak of the sort of basic vestiary of a typical warrior. But at the same time, society was simple enough at the time not to be that overwhelmingly complicated, and so more or less there would have been lots of similarities. And different, of course, fashion corresponding to the influence of often, in fact, the most close sedentaries that influenced mostly the elites that were, as always, the more international. Even Christianity reached these places. You would find very interesting combinations, but that, you could have seen also in the sort of in the vanity of the lower ranked fighters. The Chueh standards. This is important before we talked about the wolf, all right? Both the eastern and western branches of the Gokturks used a gold she-wolf's head as their standard, a symbol that embodied the two Chueh's martial identity and their mythological connection to a wolf ancestor, fostering unity across their confederacy. Now, why the gold she-wolf? As we explained before, the she-wolf, so especially also in the female element and in the lower sort of kind of ground animal sort of follower of the war bands, represented the sort of basic condition of the warrior, so the lower kind, so to say, but golden, so fully transfigured in a divine sense. So this means that basically you don't forget your origins, you don't forget that even the last can become the first, and that there is all a specific, straightforward military, religious identity to these people. As we've seen, society is brutally simple in early medieval Central Asia. It's of a level of traumatic brutality that you can't even imagine. It's even better really that for us not to have enough information about how these people lived. But the symbol is simple and straightforward, which is also mirroring a bit like the success of the Gokturks, that it's not like they branded their empire by the gold she-wolf and they they went by that. But if anything, it's the consequence of the latter. It went in parallel, and it spoke a universal language of the steppes. This is important and reflecting in part like the primitively simple effectiveness of the enormous power that the two Chueh gained throughout these centuries. Because, by the way, as you know, the Khaganate went on for, even the two halves went on for a freaking long time. At some point, we can make more specific videos about the one, the other. Again, there is plenty to have fun with, and especially in the specials, we will invent something for it. The Wolf standard is described in Chinese records, was carried into battle, obviously enough, to rally troops. Its golden sheen visible from afar, boosting morale and signaling the Khan's presence, which was obviously critical in maintaining cohesion during large-scale campaigns to begin with, and imperial power was contained, like in the Oceanic one, in the she-wolf's golden head. Western Chueh chieftains, such as the ones of the Tung Shih-hu, Western Chueh tribe, would, let's imagine it, wear a green satin coat buttoned to the left and a 10-foot red silk field wrapped around his braided hair. Maybe a golden hair, who knows? The Western two Chueh were equipped with lances and straight self-bows. Their tribal elite wore coarse and fine woolen clothing. This attire reflected their wealth and status derived from control over the lucrative trade routes, which had this deep and profound political and economic consequences for their interactions with neighboring empires. And so, again, we talk about the Khaganate, but there were sort of subgroups that at some point rose to greater or lesser prominence, depending on circumstances and their location across the steppes. Again, coming to be part of a broader domino effect of relation with China, with other cultures and so on, that manipulated them, and by being manipulated by these peoples as well. The chieftains' elaborate dress, as you could, for example, derive from Sogdian trade records, served as a display of power during the negotiations, reinforcing the two Chueh's influence in Central Asian diplomacy. So saying we are civilized, we appreciate the benefits of civilization, especially as elites. Let's tie each other more like mostly as a cooptation, but still with some kind of threat from these steppes people's raids. More than else, if anything, favorable trade agreements with Persian and Byzantine merchants were a bit the fame, the wealth, the fortune of these peoples. They would, if anything, fight more against one another, as we've seen with the Western and the Eastern, but being manipulated by the bigger sedentary civilizations than wanting, in fact, this system to break. And that's obviously where it was easier to break it. Like, I don't know, the Sasanians in China didn't have much interest, of course, for the Silk Route not to work or by going at one another. There were these peoples in between. So, if anything, their infiltration, their influence mostly worked on these peoples themselves, fragmenting them further, in this sense alleviating the pressure on the frontiers as well. Because as we've seen, as big as these guys were, they were also more ambitious and very often not really glad to side with civilization. Again, the Gokturks literally tell to beware of China, of its ways. There is a true Turkic identity that they strive to maintain, but also in a more sort of tendentially unitary fashion, meaning that if we manage not to be broken, not to be split in the civil wars, so by preventing, let's say, large swathes of us to be Sinicized, just to be bought by the tanks of whomever, we can be a stronger force. It makes a lot of sense. It's a civilizational concept. Imagine all the, the possible interplays across the generations that unfortunately we can't even fully document at a point. And so you have sometimes literally Sogdian mercantile documents telling us what kind of relation was at play in among these peoples, right? So again, difficult stories to tell at a point because of the general introductory character of these videos. Again, this is just like the version, or let's say the Chinese version of these peoples, and for the rest, we will have to talk very often about all this other population in detail, and also from the Western perspective or other perspectives, given that we have especially this enormous extent of the Khaganate at the time, which makes you really impressed by the sheer wealth and power that it could leverage. Again, I made a video about Göktürk and Sogdian warfare that in many ways I accumulated, but I made also plenty of videos about Turkic and Turkish warfare at some point. I put them all together, but I should differentiate that at some point as well. And you can see, again, multiple episodes. We will talk about also the Uyghurs again. Their warfare is fairly similar, as we explained, but at the same time, there is always something new to dig into, to be really complete. I'm glad we treated in some fair amount of wealth steppes warfare. There are some videos I made years ago really that I would have to remake now, because these ones today I'm not going to remake because they're decent enough. But some of the first, like, I don't know, I'm seeing here the Timurid army organization, having even the pictures. At the time I used to use much less pictures because I either re-uploaded them in haste or I couldn't find all the proper reference, or I hadn't accumulated them. I had less time literally to make the video. Today I have a massive mine of material, also visually wise, to put this all together. So it's of course, like in the future you could say, well, Schwerpunkt's videos will have improved, etc. They are improving towards still sort of a homemade direction. I'm not planning to step up that kind of level. Like the content has been improving by itself, but it's overall fairly it's destined a bit to remain the way it is. That maybe somebody can help or whatever, but I'm fine with what I'm doing. And so again, this video is a bit so-so because, like, again, I wish I made something more cohesive here. We talk a bit about everything, like general political step background, army organization, tactics, whatever. Again, certain topics deserve some greater attention, but to give a broader picture of the world, this stuff is not bad, really, and it can really work. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.